Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar about the NIHR Research Professorships and Host Organizational Support. We'll just start with some introductions and I'll just go through the housekeeping elements of it. So I am Tom Pratt and I work at the NIHR Academy. I work in the Personal Awards team. And I'm delighted to say we're joined by two of our committee members. So we've got Richard and Louise. If you'd like to introduce yourselves. Richard, if you'd like to go first.
Hi, I'm Richard McManus. I'm a GP by background, Professor of Primary Care Research at the University of Oxford and Chair of the Research Professors Selection Committee.
Thank you. And Louise?
Afternoon all, I'm Louise Kenny. I'm an obstetrician and gynaecologist by background and a clinician scientist, and I'm Executive Pro-Vice Chancellor of Health and Life Sciences at the University of Liverpool, and I'm Deputy Chair of the NIHR RP Selection Committee.
So thank you both, Richard and Louise, for taking the time to join us for this webinar, which I hope will be useful for everyone. So in terms of the way the webinar is going to work, so if you need to contact us, you can use the chat function that my colleague Liz will be managing. And we'll also have Q&A at the end. So please use the Q&A function. We'll be using the upvoting for that. So if there's a question that you want to be answered, please upvote that, and that will help us at the Q&A section in terms of trying to prioritize the questions to get through. There is a transcript available on this video, and also the webinar is being recorded, so this will be available on the YouTube channel, and we'll email it to everyone that signed up to the webinar as well, so you can view this afterwards. So yes, we would like to get started, so I'm going to hand over to Richard to start the slides.
Thanks, Tom. So over the next little while, we're going to go through a range of topics around the research professor scheme, and particularly thinking about hosts and institutions, because I think that's the main group that are on the call today. So next slide, please. So the thing that we want to really impress on everyone listening is that we're interested in all eligible members of the health and care research community. And we have tried to skew the scheme to make sure that we get diverse applications. As you'll hear, all of the applications have to come through nominations through institutions, and each institution is allowed 3 nominations at most. If 2 are nominated, 1 must be female. If 3 are nominated, 1 must be female and 1 must be from an ethnic minority group, and we'll come on to that more as we go along. So next, please. So the context of research professorships is very much key to the NIHR key operating principles. Applications need to be based on programs of work that are both excellent and are going to have impact. Individuals have got to have had a strong track record and have ambition for improving on that. In terms of our inclusion of individuals, we include the whole range of protected characteristics. We encourage and include methodologists of all types, and we recognise the broad remit of NIHR and NHS and social care. Collaborative research is really encouraged, and there's a section on the form about collaborations, and we want to choose our research professors for those who are going to be able to generate the evidence that both the NHS and social care systems use going forward to become more effective. Next slide, please. You can see along the top the career pathways that are funded through NIHR fellowships, running from pre-doctoral up to research professorship, which is the most senior. The scheme's been going since 2011 and in general opens each year in September with a closing date that's sometimes end of November, sometimes beginning of December, varying slightly from year to year, but is as you'll see, that is a relatively short time span to get these applications going. So we're really encouraging people to think in advance. That's one of the reasons for having this webinar today. These fellowships are really very much career changing. They offer up to £2 million per individual, comprising salary, support posts, research costs, leadership training costs, and as you may well be aware from an institutional point of view, also overheads that go with that individual. They're open, as I've said, to any professional background, clinical or methodologists, and they're open to HEIs, NHS trusts, and other providers of public health and/or care services based in England. That's changed, that they were previously only open to HEIs and NHS trusts, but we've broadened them to the other providers to make sure that we weren't excluding people. As I've said, applications are by nomination only. Next slide, please. The overall remit of NIHR is from early translational, experimental medicine, clinical and applied health research, including social care research. And that is the case for these research professorships. So some of the more junior professorships that the NIHR runs exclude the early translational work, but in research professorships, these are included. But we do expect that there is going to be a clear and plausible path to patient or public benefit. So quite often, for example, we see people who have maybe done early translational work in the context of a BRC coming with a slightly more applied program of work, including trials, for example, of interventions that they've developed in earlier stages. We don't support basic research or work involving animals or their tissue. We do support educational research and methodological research, as long as it's got a practical application and has clear patient benefit. And most importantly, we want to give opportunities for the best candidates, regardless of where they're from, in terms of a professional background, their gender, their ethnicity, or where they're from a geographical point of view. Next slide, please. Now, this is important. I'm just going to sort of do this slide in reverse order. So just looking at the bottom, you'll see there's a table here that Tom has done for us that shows the impact of geography, or at least geography in terms of Russell Group or not, or Golden Triangle or not. Golden Triangle being defined as Oxford, Cambridge or London. And you can see that, for example, the majority of applications are from within the Russell Group. Success rate of 16% overall, but becoming more successful if you look in terms of the last 5 rounds, with 1 in 5 success. Hosts not in the Russell Group have generally struggled in comparison, and that's one of the reasons to do this talk today, to try and make sure that everyone understands what the scheme is, what the rules, as it were. You can see that hosts in the Golden Triangle have got pretty much even right from the beginning in terms of success, and in general they've been pretty successful. But we do look and do try and make sure that not all our candidates are just coming from Oxford or Cambridge, and I say that as someone from Oxford. The kind of people that we're looking for are those who've got strong upwards trajectories. Now, we do realise that careers come in phases, and particularly those with caring responsibilities, for example, may have gaps or plateaus, for example, where they've had maternity leave or carers leave. That's fine, and there are points in the form to explain an individual's journey, as it were. We're interested in the narrative that is written on the form in terms of CVs. There's a whole section explaining about the individual's research background and how they've come to be where they are. we can only judge what we see. So we do want candidates to explain if they've had a slightly, should we say, non-standard journey. Next slide. The research programme is probably the most important part of the application, and it's really obvious, particularly at interview, if the candidate is excited by what they're proposing, because that rubs off on the committee. The cutting edge nature of these is becoming, I think, perhaps more apparent in the last couple of years. For example, methodologists thinking about new types of trials, new ways of analysis. We've had, for example, surgeons applying similar operative procedures to a whole range of different types of operation. New ways of thinking about how to do answer research questions. Although there's a very significant amount of funding available, £2 million is not enough, for example, to run a whole series of substantive trials. So we are very aware that candidates will need further funding as they go along. We're interested, and we have each RP has 3 support posts, so we're very interested in the development of others. We want to see on the form what's happened in the past in terms of PhDs, for example, masters, bringing along more junior colleagues. We want to understand how this professorship will be transformational on that individual's as a person, but also their discipline. Collaborations are really important, as I've mentioned, and there is a section on the form for development, which perhaps is easy to forget about because everyone worries about the research. So it's really important that candidates think about all the sections on the form. Next, please.
Right, so
yeah,
I think it's yeah.
Louise, next.
Yeah. So I will just talk you through the application process. So as Richard said, institutions can nominate up to 3 candidates every cycle, every round for the RP, and we run this competition yearly. If an institution is advancing 2 candidates, one of them must be female. And if they choose to forward 3 candidates for the competition, the 3rd candidate must be from an ethnic minority. And that is a very deliberate choice on behalf of NIHR to make sure that we get as diverse a pool as possible. So 2 candidates, one must be a woman, and if an institution decides to advance a 3rd, that candidate must be from an ethnic minority. Because this is such a prestigious competition, many institutions, including my own, actually run an internal competition, more of which in a minute. But it is up to the institutions who they nominate. So that's really important to flag. So if you are a candidate contemplating applying for this competition, you have to be nominated by your institution. The second restriction on candidates is that candidates must be within 5 years of their most recent appointment at either professor, associate professor, reader, or SL level. And there is an allowance made for those candidates who've worked flexibly. So if you're uncertain about your eligibility, please do check with the NIHR Academy office, who will be very understanding and very receptive and helpful. So within 5 years of the most recent appointment. In general, the most successful candidates come forward within a few years of their appointment, usually to reader or SL level, or within a year or so of being a chair. We do occasionally see candidates who've been a chair for 4 or on the cusp of 5 years and on the cusp of being eligible. But the vast majority of candidates are within a few years of their most senior appointment. These are quite complex applications. They are many pages in length and require quite a lot of consideration to pull together the kind of programme that Richard's just described. They're not the kind of applications that can be dashed off, in our experience, within just a few weeks. They need to be prepared well in advance. And so in general, we encourage institutions to identify potential candidates in advance. And my own institution, the University of Liverpool, runs an internal process which starts well in advance of the deadline. So we are already identifying candidates in anticipation of the deadline for the next competition. It's a three-stage process. So there is a shortlisting followed by peer review only after shortlisting, and then an interview process. And it is quite competitive, as you would imagine, because these are incredibly prestigious awards. They're the pinnacle of the personal awards offered by NIHR. And in any given year, we usually have around 35 to 40 applications. This year we had 37. And we have sufficient funding most years to offer 5 places. Occasionally we can fund 6. So that gives you an idea of the success rates. Next slide, please. Over the years, we found that a key challenge for the committee is ensuring that we have satisfactory support from the nominating partnership. The host institutional commitment is critical. And it's also important that it's delivered. So what's promised in the application then it's important that that's delivered. And we do have a mechanism for checking on that, and Tom will speak to that shortly. We look for a really good, excellent support package. So at baseline, we expect that institutions will fully recycle the applicant's salary in support of the applicant and their programme. So not just partial buyout of clinical time or partial buyout of teaching time, but actually full recycling of the entire salary, that in the case of a clinical academic, from both the hospital and HEI, and in the case of a non-clinical academic, the entire salary should be recycled in support of the research programme. But over and above that, there must be evidence of long-term support, including after the award. So we specifically look for the host institution to indicate that the candidate will remain on staff in post in a tenured position after the award is concluded. The support should be really specific. So we look for more than just a commitment to recycle a salary with unspecified posts. We actually look for what sort of posts they are and how they will offer support to the wider programme. Over and above that, in our experience, successful candidates have more support from their host organisation than just salary recycling. For example, additional top-up for the posts that are supplied by NIHR, turning non-clinical into clinical training posts, or extending 3-year PDRAs into 5-year lecturerships. Additional admin support is also something that we see coming through a lot from successful applications. It's entirely up to the candidate and the nominating organisation what additional support they have and how it's configured. But it does need to be real, it does need to be detailed, it does need to be substantiated, and we do check that it is actually delivered on. And ultimately, successful candidates can port their awards to more supportive organisations. I've been on the panel for nearly a decade now. This is my final year, and I don't think anyone has actually ported their award yet, but several candidates have explored it. And then eventually support from their nominating organisation has been forthcoming. But this is a critical thing. So this is largely aimed at the nominating partnerships. We are quite exasperated by host organisations that don't offer any support for these awards. They are the pinnacle of what NIHR offer, and we expect to see a commitment that reflects that. Next slide, please. In terms of how we score the applications, they're against 4 criteria, and one of them is the nominating partnership. What we look for is that this is a suitable place and a suitable partnership within which this research can be conducted. So we look for excellence in terms of their research track record, a supportive research culture, evidence of commitment to the principles for quality, diversity, inclusion. And we also look for a very specific statement around research integrity. We also make sure that this is a strategic fit, that the programme under review fits with the organisation, with the partnership, that it is of strategic significance and value, both to the candidate and also to the nominating partnership at a local and at a national level. And I've already mentioned how much emphasis we put on the support of the host organisation to the nominee, not just in terms of the actual support for the award, but also in the medium and long term. So there is a very specific place on the form in which the host organisation has to specify the support that they offer, both for the programme under review, but for the candidate in the medium and long term. On occasion, we find that the support is not at a level that we would expect, and where the candidate themselves is viewed to be very competitive with a very compelling programme, we often do send feedback to the nominating organisation that their support is the weak link in the chain, and we offer them a chance to correct that before the candidate comes forward for interview. And if it's not corrected, candidates, despite the fact they may be of the desired quality with a very compelling programme, and not advanced for interview. So that really does just underscore the importance of the host and the host support. Next slide, please. So finally, the internal selection process, and I'm speaking now with both an NIHR panel member hat on, but also a PVC hat on. As we said, 3 candidates can be nominated by each university for this competition. If universities are nominating 3, we seek for a diverse pool, so 1 must be female and at least 1 must be from an ethnic minority. It's our suggestion that each university puts a robust and very transparent plan in place well before the autumn launch, the September launch of the professorship programme, for making these choices, to give the candidates the best possible chance at putting together a compelling programme. In my university, we open the competition, the internal demand competition, in late spring. We run that process through early summer, and we make our decision as to who our preferred candidates are well in advance of the September call opening, to give the nominated candidates, the candidate or candidates, the best possible length of time in which to prepare their application. And I think in general, that's a really good process and one that we would urge other universities to emulate. Next slide. So I'll hand over to Tom now.
Thank you, Louise. So just wanted to talk about some of the areas where we are looking to just make sure we're monitoring that host organisation support that Richard and Louise have talked about. So obviously the first stage would be at the shortlisting and review stage. So when they come for interview, hopefully that is at a level that we would expect. So I'm just going to talk about what happens for those people that are awarded the research professorship. So in terms of contracting, we would just make it clear to the host organisation what they've put in their application to say this is what is going to be provided to the research professor. So it's just a reminder at that stage when the contract's being signed between the host organisation and the NIHR about what is expected. We'll also make sure that there are various stages where we can just monitor that and make sure, for example, that the posts that have been promised are being advertised and being recruited to, and also certain promises about, relieving the research professorship or the research professor from those teaching and administrative duties, that has happened, because sometimes we've had the example where hosts have said, it's tricky to find people to, step up to those positions. But once the research professorship contract is signed and the award has started, we're expecting that the research professor can concentrate fully on what is being proposed in that, in terms of their research elements, but also their leadership and development elements as well. And there'll also be various reporting stages during the award as well. So we will have annual reports from the research professor, of which one part is referring to the institutional support, and if that is being delivered as expected. And also the research professor will be coming in front of the committee as part of their mid-award review So it's a similar format to the interview in terms of there will be a presentation and then questions about that, and they'll be providing a report from their progress from the start to date. And again, what Richard and Louise and the rest of the committee will be picking up on is also that chance just to go into a bit more detail about what has the host provided and if there's any snags, because obviously if there are any issues, then the NIHR are very proactive about trying to get involved in those to try and make sure the professor can concentrate fully on what they need to in terms of that research program, their leadership and development, and also the development of their team, and whether that's NIHR funded or what's being funded by the host directly. So that is the end of the slides. We will be sending these round afterwards, so there's just a few useful links. So we've got the scheme page on there for applicants and also for the institutions to look at in terms of the guidance notes are on there. And also a list of who's been funded previously for there. We do have an email address, so as was mentioned earlier, if you've got any queries about eligibility, whether that's from a host organisation internal selection process or the applicant directly, please do contact us to check because eligibility is something you want to get clear before you put your name in there, or if you're considering an applicant to be put forward. So we will move to the Q&A now. So I'll stop sharing the slides and we will have a gallery view. So we've got a few questions. Do feel free to put questions in and I'll vote the ones you'd like to be answered. This is quite a unique opportunity to have Richard and Louise here. So any questions you do have, do put them in. So we'll start at the top. I think there's a few process ones. So the first one in terms of global health research professors, the nominations are similar for global health, but it's just 2 nominations that can be made for that, but it still has the same rule about if 2 being put forward, then 1 must be a female applicant.
But it's 5
in total across the 2 schemes. So 3 for the domestic research professor and 2 for the global research prof. But yeah, if there's any queries about that, as I said, do get in touch with us to query that.
Just to point out, Tom, I answered the one about the host, whether it can be a trust or an HEI in the chat. So the answer is yes, it can be an NHS trust.
Okay. And another fairly quick one, there's a question about the pre-application support fund. So yes, the research professorship is eligible for that. So if someone wants to apply for that to help them prepare an application for the research professorship, then that is allowed to. So yes, I'll throw this over to Louise. So how does the committee take into account the differences between host institutions in terms of their ability to provide the additional support? So, small versus, potentially a large Russell Group university. So Louise, would you like to start on that?
Yeah, thanks. It's a really good question. So the short answer is yes, we do take that into account. So small specialist organisations who don't have the sort of very deep pockets of the big research intense Russell Groups can make that abundantly clear in their supportive statement, in their statement around host support. We still do expect full recycling of the salary, but we are a little bit kinder, or we view their ability to offer additional support over and above that through a slightly different lens. To be candid, though, the panel are most concerned with the rather perverse relationship between the larger and more research intense and frankly richer organisations tend to be the ones that put the really weak support packages around candidates, and that's been historically how we have seen this play out over many years. Every now and again, we write to all the PVCs. So I have been in the strange position of actually asking for a letter to be sent to all the PVCs and then 6 weeks later receiving the letter, telling all the provost chancellors and deans about how poor our support is. But we do expect the larger ones who are capable of putting more support around candidates. The one other thing I would say as a PVC in this particular year to anyone who's looking at this through the institution lens is we are in really unprecedented financial waters as a sector right now. And I know that all the funders, NIHR and UK and across the UKRI funding councils, are aware that our ability to provide significant match is under extreme pressure. So that, I think, will be taken into account in this year's competition, because a lot of universities are certainly facing unprecedented financial challenges. But yes, the short answer is we do take into account the ability of an organisation to provide support.
Thank you, Louise. Richard, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, just to reiterate really what Louise has said, that speaking as someone from Oxford, a couple of years ago, I did have to talk to some of my colleagues about making sure that at Oxford that the offer was equivalent to other institutions. And I think we did that reasonably successfully. And one of the ways we did it was to get departments who were putting offers together to make sure that they had seen what their colleagues were doing in terms of the internal competition, because we took that into account, and then made it very clear. And I think there's actually quite helpfully now on the website in terms of the instructions for these applications. There's an example of the sort of the sort of support package that's required, and those really are pretty much a minimum compared with what we see. Sometimes we see very generous packages, and as Louise said, they're rarely from, should we say, the Golden Triangle. They're often from other institutions.
Great, thank you. So the next one I'll just answer quickly is about the feedback from the committee regarding the support from the host. Is it sent to the research office or directly to the applicant? Previously, we've sent the feedback from the shortlisting and peer review stage directly to the applicant. But this year we have had a slight change of tack, so the applicant still gets the feedback from us, but we have written a letter to an organisation directly to the lead signatory to indicate what the feedback is regarding that specific element. So for future years, if there is something where we feel that it is substandard before an interview, we will be sending that feedback specifically to the lead signatory, so it can be addressed hopefully in front of the committee for the interview. So the next one is, does an applicant need to have an NIHR grant awarded previously prior to the application? Louise, would you like to field this one first?
So again, it's not a mandatory expectation, but the reality is that these awards are the pinnacle of the personal awards given by the Academy and NIHR. And it would be usual to see a sustained track record of competitive peer-reviewed funding, usually a mixture of NIHR funding as well as other UKRI funding councils. The funding track record is something that we do look at, and we do score during our reviews. So whilst it doesn't necessarily need to be the majority of NIHR funding, we do expect to see a healthy portfolio of competitively awarded peer-reviewed funding for any given application.
Thank you very much. Richard, do you want to add anything about grants?
No, I think Louise has answered that.
Thank you very much. So for host support, a question from Ray Perrins. So it talks about reviewing stage being rated out of 3, poor, adequate, excellent. So the scoring at the moment is a score of 1 to 6. So 1 is poor and 6 is excellent. So I think in terms of so I think Ray's question is just in terms of if they get 3 adequates, does this mean an applicant would be essentially uncompetitive? If we have a candidate getting 3 adequates, then is it difficult to persuade the host that more support is needed? I mean, I think we might be talking about slightly different things here. So my interpretation of the question is if...
Right, what I would say to that is that we never... So if a candidate is excellent and the research programme that's presented is excellent, and the nominating partnership is the right place to conduct this work, and the only thing that's weak on the application is the host support, we're going to bring that candidate forward with feedback to the host organisation that the candidate is great, the research programme is great, but their support is not adequate. If they don't get shortlisted, it is not just because of the host support. There will be additional reasons. It's the one thing that we can change between submission and interview. It's the one lever we have with the organisation at that point to improve their support package. But we never turn down a competitive candidate with a great programme because their support package is weak, without at least trying to get more out of the nominating partnership. So if the candidate hasn't been shortlisted and they've had feedback that the support package was adequate, they haven't gone down because of the support package, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, but the corollary to that would be that if we're contacting you about a candidate who has been shortlisted for interview, saying that the package is not up to scratch, that means that that individual is very competitive and is in the top 15 or so. Is usually slightly less than 15, but round numbers 15 of the candidates. So they're usually in the top third of the people who've applied. And so if we're contacting you about that individual specifically, then that's a really good message that this is someone we think is very strong, and that it may well have an influence on whether or not that person gets into the top 5.
Thank you both. So I think we're just looking to clarify an element here of the eligibility. So someone has just asked, just to confirm, are these RPs only open to people who have been promoted to the most recent post in the last 5 years? I guess the answer to that is yes, but with the caveats around, as Louise and Richard outlined, for people that have maybe had breaks in employment or less than full-time working for personal reasons. What I would suggest is talk to ourselves, and if you're going through the internal process as well, check with your host in terms of that. But we're more than happy to speak to anyone who's got a bit of a query around that 5 years eligibility. Richard or Louise, did you want to talk about, and do you get queries around this through internal competitions?
Yeah, no, I think that summarises it, Tom. So we are flexible on candidates who have trained flexibly. The team at NIHR will always answer questions on that eligibility, but in general it is as laid out. So you have to be within 5 years of appointment to the role that you currently hold at either SL, reader or professor level. Yeah,
I think the one thing we haven't changed this yet, but we have been discussing it. So we had last week a seminar in Leeds for particularly looking at healthcare professionals who are not medical, and thinking about them. And it was put to us at that in that fora that sometimes, for example, a nurse might be promoted to full professor earlier on in his or in her or his career, and that should we take that into account? Now we said that we would take that and think about that, and I think that that's something that could go in the narrative, I guess, and could be discussed with the office beforehand if there was someone who, for whatever reason, had, for example, been promoted very early and then had not had an opportunity to do any research for a period of time. Perhaps because of other responsibilities, we might be able to look at that.
Yep, indeed. Thank you. So a question is, if an institution has not received feedback on their commitment, can they assume the commitment levels have been good/appropriate? So the feedback has gone to the candidates for this round, for those being brought to interview. If there are real serious concerns, then a letter would have gone to the lead signatory, but feedback will be available there. That's not to say that a host can't look at improving it where there is feedback. So the candidates will have that, and hopefully this leads on to our next question, which is, I think, a candidate looking for a bit of advice from you both about someone who worries that their support is insufficient and they want all the ammunition to persuade their host to improve it. So Louise, do you want to kick this one off about advice?
Well, we have on occasion sent letters round to all deans and PVCs of all universities, urging them to improve the support they put around candidates for this competition, with some details of what we would consider to be competitive. So full recycling of salary and additional support over and above that. And to give you a rough idea, and this is just with my PVC hat on now. Since I've been in post the last 6 years, Liverpool have put a candidate forward in this competition every year, and we've had 4 or 5, I think, successful candidates through both the global panel, which I don't sit on, in fact, predominantly the global panel, and this one as well. And over and above salary recycling, we put in a support package that's worth about £250,000 over the course of 5 years. So it's an additional £50,000 of support a year, which we allow the candidates to use flexibly, either to top up the NIHR support that's included in the award, or to provide admin support or additional team support. They can use it entirely flexibly, however they see fit, but it's around about the £250,000 mark. And I get a feel from what I see coming through the panel that is competitive. It's not astonishingly generous. It's certainly not at one end of the spectrum, but it's certainly not the worst that we see. So I think that's in the competitive kind of middle bracket. And if it helps, you can say that that's what was said by Professor Kenny at this webinar, that they need to be thinking of salary recycling and something in the order of about £250,000 over and above that. And the justification for that is, as we've said numerous times in this webinar, these are the pinnacle of NIHR awards. But we know that these candidates go on to be successful leaders in their fields. We know that. And for the organisations involved, for the nominating partnerships, that comes with a massive benefit, because the multiplier in terms of additional peer-reviewed funding that these candidates will generate and the amazing output and impact they have is significant. And so as a panel, we expect to see that recognised and matched by appropriate host support from the get-go. So that's what Liverpool do. I think that's similar to most competitive bids. It's not outrageously generous, but it's certainly not stingy.
Just got a question here. Sorry, Richard.
Just other bits of practical advice. I think in general, people who've got research professorships are very happy to talk to prospective candidates. So have a look at the list on the website as who's been funded recently. By all means, bung them an email. They may or may not be able to feel able to share their application and what they put in, but I think many people will. Or at least will talk to you about the kind of support that they had. So that's one thing. Another thing which I think speaks to one of the other questions here is to do benchmarking across your institution. There's one of them. One of the questions is about different parts of the same institution putting forward bids, and I think that's a really good way to level up, not level down to the average, but level up to the best support that's being put forward. And do have a look. Certainly in Oxford, that was one of the ways that we improved the ask, because we're able to say, well, look, here's Department A, who's putting forward this, why are you putting forward so much less? And that was quite successful.
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to come to that question about benchmarking, but thank you for answering that, Richard. So we've got one here about a potential candidate who is non-medical, a computer scientist who has no NIHR funding, but the innovation can be transformative for the NHS. They work with clinicians, so was never a PI on an NIHR grant. They have significant funding from non-NIHR. Are they excluded? So Louise, would you like to?
Yeah, so the short answer is they're not excluded. I think they sound like a very compelling candidate. So we do welcome applications from non-medically qualified candidates who are working at the interface of interdisciplinary research that has direct impact for the NHS, and this would be an exemplar of that kind of candidate. They don't need, as I said before, they don't need a sustained track record of NIHR research, either as a co-I or a PI, but they do need to have a significant portfolio of peer-reviewed research funding. So if they have that and it's from other UKRI funding councils or from Wellcome or from Gates, or then they would be very competitive. And I think they can articulate very clearly what their career trajectory has been within the form to explain how they got from A to B. But on the face of what we know about this candidate here, I would say they'd be a strong candidate.
Yeah, and I think I would recommend they have a look at Professor David Clifton, who was awarded in 2022, who doesn't sound too dissimilar from what's been described as an applicant.
Yeah.
Richard, sorry.
I was just going to say exactly the same thing, that David is from my institution. He does have some BRC funding now, but I think probably at the point he applied, he would have only had a small amount of, if any, NIHR funding and mostly other funding. And obviously, I was excluded from the process, but I think he was a strong candidate from what I understand.
A very compelling candidate. Yeah.
So we have an inquiry from someone who's been a professor for more than 10 years, but they're in a new role at a new institute. Does that change their eligibility under the 5-year rule?
No, it doesn't. So if someone has been a professor elsewhere and they've just moved to a new job, they don't refresh the clock. It's within 5 years of their most senior appointment, regardless of where that was. The other thing is that we are looking for candidates, and the reason why we sort of fixate on that, 5 years within 5 years of your most senior appointment, is we're looking for candidates who are at that what we call inflection point in their career. They've established national prominence, they have international leadership potential, and they're at that inflection point. And in general, they are candidates who are within 5 years of that appointment to either a professorship or a readership, or depending on the university, an associate professorship or an SL. A candidate who's been a professor for 10 years would not be the sort of candidate or at the stage of their career that these awards are really aimed at.
What I would recommend for someone who has been a professor for that period of time, an award you would be eligible for would be the NIHR Senior Investigator. So that is another annual competition that we run. So it might be worth looking at that, because once you pass that 5 years, then you'll be on the scope of our personal awards. So we've got a question around the scoring and weighting criteria, if it's available. I will go away and check that. I mean, it certainly is when you get the feedback, but I mean, generally speaking, and we can follow this up after the webinar, the 4 sections that are scored on a scale of 1 to 6 are the applicant, the proposed research program, the proposed leadership and development program, and then the support from the partnership. So those are the 4 areas, and they're all scored 1 to 6. And then Louise, Rich, and the rest of the committee will review all the reviews that come in and the scores to make that decision about who makes the cut-off.
Yeah, and just to say that this is the first year that we've used this system, but I think I'm right in saying that the average for someone shortlisted was well into the 5s. And I think that reflected the very high quality of the people applying.
We do have a question about global health research professorship. So we have just covered the domestic research profs with a few areas that are probably applicable to both, but we are looking to do a separate webinar because I think we're aiming for different audiences for that particular one, because we're particularly trying to attract applications from organisations in low and middle income countries. So some of the information here is applicable, but we'll be looking to do a specific webinar for that award later in the year. So we do have a final question. If you've got any other questions, then we've got a few minutes left, but just around organisation requesting previous feedback. The feedback has gone to the applicants, so it is available there. But what I would suggest, if there's any organisations looking to get that feedback previously, then do ask the academy on the contact email address, and we'd be happy to look into that feedback if you've not seen it, or the applicant who's received it has left. We can try and share that if there's particular issues or anything you want to resolve. So those are all the questions. Richard or Louise, do you have any closing words to say to potential hosts and applicants?
No, just to say that if anyone does have any additional questions that pop into your head after this webinar, or if something comes up in the next few weeks, I know the NIHR team are very receptive and always happy to answer any queries that come their way. But Richard and myself are also happy to provide any advice, both from an NIHR panel member perspective, but I can also share my experience as a PVC, and I know Richard would share his experience as a previous awardee of this competition. So please do feel free to contact us. Our email addresses are freely available on the web.
Yeah, and I guess that my final thoughts would be, I think that the piece that Louise spoke to about preparation and the sort of timing of this needing to be a good 6 months before the closing date, not just waiting for the opening date in terms of institutions thinking about candidates. That's probably the most important thing, because these are really, these are 50, 60-page applications. They're not the kind of thing that you can just rush off. So I think that's really important. The other thing to say is for any institutions that are on the call, I'm sorry, we can't see live which institution they are, but any institutions who haven't put someone forward, really have a look at your pool of people and think about who you could put forward, because we want to try and make sure that this scheme does fund those people from as broader constitution as possible. And there are definitely some institutions who've never had a research professor funded who we would like to fund. We've never, for example, had a nurse funded as a research professor. We'd really like to do that. So please do think about it. I'm sure Tom and as Louise has said, myself and her would be very happy to answer any questions. And put people in touch potentially with previous award holders who can also share support. And I think personally, when I applied, it was really helpful being able to talk to a couple of successful candidates from the year before.
Okay, thank you. So we've just got a couple of very late questions, so I'll just try and cover these off quickly, just so we can have a clean slate to finish with. So there's one about, do you have to have a high degree to be eligible, like the advanced fellowships? We've not put it as prominent in the guidance notes, like we do for the advanced fellowship, saying that you have to have a PhD or an MD for this, but I think it's kind of implied in terms of the trajectory that you'll have in order to get to that senior level to be eligible for this, that there would be something in place like that, particularly if you're kind of at that cusp of being a professor. So yeah, I think that is, it's not in the guidance notes, but it's kind of implied by the level you have to be at to apply. Do you get any similar queries like that, Louise, internally, or?
No, as an organisation, we wouldn't advance anyone without a PhD, because my feeling is that they wouldn't be competitive. So even if it's not explicit in the guidance, I think there is an expectation that, given the seniority of this award and its prestigious nature, we would expect candidates leaving our organisation as our nominees to have an MD or a PhD or equivalent.
And I think the final question is probably more suitable for, we'll probably do a separate webinar on the pre-application support fund, but I think the idea is that it's quite broad in terms of what people want to spend that award on to try and improve their potential application to the scheme. So thank you everyone for the questions. I'd like to thank Richard and Louise for their time today. And we hope that has been useful, and we look forward to a number of applications from a wide range of organisations in the future round. So thank you everybody, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.